Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our Kubernetes Masterclass today, it's Tuesday, January 26th. We have a great class for you today. Our partners, StackRox, are here to talk about declarative security. So before we jump into that, do some quick housekeeping items here. As I mentioned, StackRox is joining us today to present on this material. So we have Michael Foster, Cloud Native Advocate from StackRox, and also Andy Klemenko here today helping with Q&A. You guys want to say a quick hello?
Hey everyone, Mike Foster here. Thanks for joining.
This is Andy Klemenko. You guys have any questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A section and I will answer them and get Michael to answer them as well on video. So have a good one.
Great, thank you guys so much for joining today. So before we get into Michael's presentation, just wanted to give you guys a quick overview of our masterclass, especially for those of you who are new to this series. The class itself will take between 45 to 75 minutes. As Andy mentioned, if you have any questions, head over to the questions tab on your GoToWebinar panel, and you can type them in. We'll do our best to get to all of them, hopefully, via text, and some of them at the end during our Q&A session. We also have a channel on Slack where you can head over there to ask questions. Slack.rancher.io, and you can sign up and join. There's a masterclass channel specifically for this series. You can find all other product channels as well for community discussion. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Michael to get into today's topic.
Thanks, Connie. Thanks for the intro. Hey, everybody.
Great.
Mike Foster here. Everybody can see the main screen, right? We're all good? Awesome. Okay, so like Connie said, today, well, I'll be doing most of the speaking, and I'm going to throw all the questions to Andy, at least to give me a little bit of breathing room here. But we're going to be talking about declarative security, specifically Rancher, RKE, open source tool KubeLinter, and our tool StackRox, and how we can kind of, take a more declarative approach to security. So what we're going to cover, just going to go through some quick Kubernetes security controls to start, some basics, just so that we can kind of touch on it as we go. And we want to talk about making declarative. So we want to talk about what Rancher brings, what RKE brings, how Rancher manages the state of your Kubernetes clusters. We're also going to talk about KubeLinter. So KubeLinter is an open source tool for checking configurations. So building into your pipelines, doing things of that sort. We're also going to talk about, lastly, StackRox, so our own product and our Kubernetes rich security context that we can bring, and how we can use it as sort of a whole security stack, so to speak. And then lastly, we're going to get into a Q&A. So if I can't answer anything on the fly, or if I miss something, feel free to throw a question and raise your hand, and I'll get to you as soon as I can. So following along, yes, I'll do this real quick. I'm going to slide away from the slide. If you go to mfoster rocks, so there's a Rancher Masterclass demo environment on GitHub, or repository on GitHub. All the code there is public. This is what I'm going to be going through with you today. So if you get confused, you want to take a look, feel free to get a clone and just follow along. Getting into security controls. So just to start, again, I want to talk about the different parts of Kubernetes that we can secure and how we can do that with these tools. So starting at kind of that base level, minimizing the host OS footprint. So that means removing unnecessary packages, identifying open ports, and shutting down any unnecessary services. Luckily, Rancher OS helps with this. It's specific for Docker to build a minimalized OS for a container runtime like Docker. So, look for setting that up. Obviously, Rancher works with any sort of Docker environment since it does manage Kubernetes as a container. Updates. So if people have been following along, the CNCF have been hammering this since last year of updating off of 1.15 as it is the most popular version. So having an update cadence and a process for these updates is really important. Obviously, with something like Rancher or a containerized version of Kubernetes, updates become a lot easier than if you're using the open source version of Kubernetes. The hardening, guys. So cluster benchmarks. When we are creating our clusters, we want some sort of reference point. So whether it's CIS benchmarks or automation that's built into our cluster configuration, so we can verify that what we are doing is meeting our compliance standards. It's very important. And the more declarative that we make that, the better our systems are going to run. All right, so you have your cluster up. Now we want to talk about API access. So authentication, authorization, and admission controllers. So access to the cluster, what you can do once you get inside the cluster, and then any controllers for mutating, validating, or having some sort of functionality within the cluster. And at the core of that is RBAC, right? Roles, cluster roles, role bindings, cluster role bindings, the different roles that we give service accounts and users in the clusters, and how we limit those through things like pod security policies, which are recently deprecated, and I'll talk about coming up. Default accounts. So Kubernetes by default is very permissive, right? Which is why pod security policies were implemented. It's why things like security contexts are implemented, namespace limits and ranges. So having the proper implementation of users, groups, and service accounts, and making sure those defaults don't have access permission, that's really important in our cluster in order to limit any vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. Audit logging. So just like you would, look at a container at runtime and make sure that it's not accessing privileges that you don't want, you need to look at bad actors within your environment. So audit logging is a great way to set this up. There is, as I'll get into, you can really look at logs on a very low level or high level, whatever you need to be able to identify bad actors. You can get logs for changes. You can port logs to specific files so that your logging agent can ship them out. But yeah, again, you have control of the audit logging policy and the audit policy, which we'll talk about in the future, but very important for identifying any issues in your cluster. Moving into the deployment level, so security context. So again, enforced through PSPs right now, or OPO, or things of that sort, but really it is security context at the container and pod level that you're looking at, and that's the core functionality that isn't going away regardless of what you're using as your enforcement mechanism. So understanding your user IDs, group IDs, Linux capabilities, mounted file systems, immutability in general for your containers and pods, very important that you understand that so that we don't have any elevated privileges. And again, I mentioned this, PSPs. So they are officially deprecated. They'll be deprecated in 1.2.1 if you are unaware, and they'll be removed in 1.2.5. So there is a good conversation in the community about what is the next step. However, just remember those security contexts that's the core functionality, and then whatever Kubernetes uses for enforcement will probably change in the coming years. All right, so the core thing I want to touch on is make it declarative, make it simple for yourself, take away the human element, take away, any snowflake environments or anything like that. And really, what's the core of that? So declarative is a style of language, right? It's a tool to say what you want the environment to look like. And it basically, your code will work as documentation, right? So you want it formatted so it's readable. Obviously YAML, and to some extent, some people don't like working with YAML, but YAML is the more readable version of JSON, which might be controversial, but yeah, so you want it so that we are stating exactly what is in our cluster, any protocols, any ports that are open, so that we can go through and we understand exactly what's going on, and any changes then are then made in a version control system, which we can link back to, right? So because it's declarative, we have the ability to tear everything down and recreate all resources exactly the way it was as we defined it. Now, what does that have to do with RKE? Right. So, if you're familiar with something like Terraform or a declarative application, RKE is that declarative application for Kubernetes. So RKE runs a CNCF certified Kubernetes distribution. It's a containerized version. Like I said previously, they've taken all those core Kubernetes components and containerized them, which allows you to configure it outside a little bit easier. You don't have to use something like kubeadm, kubespray. You don't have to use those cluster tokens to bring a new node up. And you can set a lot more. You can set a lot more of the settings in a simple config file. Now it uses Docker as a container runtime. Interested to follow that in the future, as Rancher really has taken a push for securing their clusters with RKE 2 and their hardening guide as well. You can find on their website, which is extremely useful. So again, why RKE? I kind of touched on it already, but we get to implement those core Kubernetes security controls directly in the config file, right? Which I will demonstrate in 2 seconds. But that is the biggest and best thing is you get up and running. It's simple. It uses Docker, which is fairly easy. Well, it's pretty easy to install nowadays. And on top of that, they have things like Rancher OS to facilitate that. So let's check it out. Now I got a lot of stuff going on here. I'm going to be doing most of the work in here. So let me know if you can't see anything or if you want me to enlarge the screen. Like I showed you that GitHub repo from before. So mfoster_rox, if you're looking for it, and it's the Kubernetes, Rancher Masterclass demo repo, and you can follow along. But really, when you get in here, everything is pretty much in cluster setup. So I use Terraform to create a 3-node cluster in GCP. That's already set up. Now, if you were to actually create this in maybe a workplace or something like that, you'd probably have your infrastructure in a separate repo, you'd have your Kubernetes cluster configuration in a separate repo, and you'd have your, let's say, deployment configuration in another repo, all with sort of these automated checks as part of your pipeline so that you could go, hey, I want infrastructure. Okay, now I'm ready for Kubernetes. And then now I'm ready to deploy my application, right? So they're all separate. You don't have to weed your way through all this. But for now, we're doing it in one environment. And I did this by using a makefile. So you can see I use basically Terraform commands to start up the cluster. Then I use an RKE up. So just like how you'd use RKE on the command line, I can bring the cluster up using that config file. And then I also can remove it and destroy all the infrastructure if I need to. With me so far, hopefully. Awesome. So now in the files, the infrastructure is already set up. We're going to talk about starting up the cluster now. So if you run a RKE config on the command line, you are going to get a basic configuration file. So if I do a RKE, a little slow. If I run an RKE config, it's going to take me through some core, just baseline things like SSH path. It's going to ask me the number of hosts, SSH of the host, SSH port of the host, because it used SSH to basically go in, start up Docker, start these containers, and then they all bootstrap each other. Now, I don't want to get too much into this, but at the end of setting these core things that you need to do, you are going to get a cluster file. And look, I just show up. So you're going to get this just basic core YAML file that is going to show you everything that your cluster is going to have. So you can set, for example, a unique cluster name. You can set a bastion host. You can set your monitoring, whatever you need from here. I've gone ahead and set a default that when I run make apply spits out the address and username and things like that. So I don't necessarily have to go in and hard code these things. Some things I want to highlight in here are basically all the functionality that you can add so that you know that your Kubernetes cluster is exactly the same, right? If you were to go and go through a UI in Google or something like that, you're going to have to do that UI every time. You can save templates now, right? You can save templates in there, but you really don't want to work in there. So you're going to use something like Terraform or something that's more declarative. And that's what Rancher kind of allows you to do is now I can take this cluster YAML file, I can set all the defaults I want, and then every cluster is going to be the same. If I were to go and spin up VMs in Google, that Kubernetes cluster is going to have this configuration. If I want to use something on-prem, that cluster is going to have the same configuration as well. So it provides you a level of stability if you're creating multi-cloud or hybrid environments. Now, just like I said, if I have this default cluster file, which basically spits out that, I believe the cluster is not up. But what I can do is I can make just in case to make sure nothing's there. And we're just clearing out the host. Cool. And now I'm just going to bring it back up. So I'm running a make apply just to make sure that the updated like IPs and usernames get configured for the cluster file. It's just part of the make file. It's nothing crazy. It spits that out. Make RKE up. And now it's going to go through its whole setup process. Generating certificates, dialing into the nodes, performing health checks, starting all the containers, as you can see. And it's going to go through and make sure that all the images are pulled. If you are in a private, like if you're on-prem and you're private, you can set up basically bastion hosts as well. And if you're deploying an air-gapped environment, there's kind of extra setup that you have to do in order to pull those Rancher images down. But that being said, you'll have them locally, and then you'll just point to that private repository that you want to pull from for those system images.
Hey, Michael, I got a couple good questions about RKE and Terraform and Ansible. Can you explain for a quick minute why RKE, why make files? Like, what was your thinking about some of that automation, and is it replaceable with other forms of automation?
Yeah, so good question. Terraform and RKE are useful in the sense that like when they're used in their scope. So like I find Terraform really useful for declaring infrastructure as code. But if you try to do, for example, like set up, if you're trying to get into a node, let's say, or perform any local changes with Terraform, I don't really like that because you're actually going outside. You're making it more imperative than declarative, right? Now with RKE, it's sort of the same thing. You can go and create a Kubernetes cluster, but you don't want RKE to manage your YAML files, let's say, directly in here, right? You would want to do some sort of vetting of your YAML files that's separate. The reason for me trying to break it up into like infrastructure as code, RKE, cluster configuration, and deployment is because then you become portable as sort of an overall management structure, right? Let's say all of a sudden, hey, we don't need to use, RKE, let's just say, for example, and we're going to use Terraform with like some other provider. Well, Terraform's still there. We know kind of the setup that we need to do for the infrastructure, and then we just bring over our application. So by separating those things, you've also created portable environments. Now, one of the great things about Rancher, especially when you get into Rancher 2.0, is you can set all of these cluster template files and also manage other clusters through the UI. So I could say, hey, I'm on-prem. I'm going to use RKE on-prem because it's simple, easy to set up and get going. And I can also go and create a GKE cluster and manage it directly from Rancher UI. So it's keeping it simple, keeping it automatable and portable. Hopefully that answers that question. As opposed, so the way I set this up with the make file was just to kind of simulate the fact that we have these three sort of sections. So we have this Terraform setup, we have this cluster setup, and then we're going to have our application setup. That make sense?
Absolutely, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So it's actually a great filling time. It set up in about what was it, a minute and a half, which is pretty sweet. And then now it's going to spit out a admin file, a kubeconfig cluster file, which I'm not going to show you the details of that, but I'm going to move this over so that I have control and I can check out the nodes that have come up. So you can see I have the control plane nodes and the two workers that I've set up. Now, if people are aware, Weaveworks came out with like a sock shop demo. I want to say it was a while ago. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. So I've just pulled those YAML files down to, hopefully give something that people have seen before. In that manifest folder, if you're looking at the repo, it has all of the YAML files required to set up this sock shop demo. Now I put them all there. Realistically, what you probably want to do is you'd want to have the manifest separately in a separate repository so that any changes to the YAMLs can then be reverted, let's say, and you'd have some sort of CD so that your changes could be deployed directly into your Kubernetes environment. But for the sake of the demo, I put it in here to make things easy. we're going to bring that up right now with a make stock shop. So it's going to go and create the namespace and bring everything up. And that's just from the namespace already being created. So you can see it's coming up and starting to run. Now, it does take a couple minutes. Not going to go in and show you stock shop that much. It's more just to understand the workflow of what we're doing. What I really want to do is now, this is just a bare bones Kubernetes cluster, right? And I'm deploying stock shop, which is an outside resource that I haven't vetted for images. I'm pulling this directly from public workspace. I'm also like showing you public IPs. So, 100% not safe. What we want to do is we want to actually go back and say, okay, how can we set up our Kubernetes cluster to be secure from the start, right? And so we can do that by going directly back into our cluster YAML file. Now, in this cluster hardened setup, you can set up these cluster files kind of however you want. I like to break them up into specific sections. So I like to have nodes. So I have like the nodes that I want to change and set up. I have K8 services in here, anything that I need to change in the K8 services. If I go down, I have the system images. So I can directly look at which section is there, any plugin. So I've turned off Ingress, I've turned off monitoring. I don't have a private registry set up.
Hey, Michael, can you show where you can select your CNI, like Canal or Flannel or Calico? Or...
Yeah, so there's this network section right here, which again, like I have additional plugins, right? CNI being one of those additional plugins. And the default for RKE is Canal. They actually have a really good resource on their website that has some baselines and all the plugins that they support. So I think they support like Canal, they support Flannel, Calico. I'm blanking on a couple other ones, but I think they support like 5 or 6. And you can directly just set it from there, which is great. And you can configure those plugins as well from directly in here. Now, and then, so then we have cluster upgrades. So there are upgrade strategies as well. And then at the end, we have all our add-ons. So if we want to set default service accounts, default PSPs, anything like that, we can put them in directly from the bottom. And again, configuration as code, right? Which is awesome. Now, some things I just want to touch on in this file. Let me just make this a little bigger for you guys. The node setup is going to be specific to your use case. So it's nothing too crazy. If you want to set up default SSH certs, you can do that directly in here. I would kind of recommend you would do it as your infrastructure as code for access, but up to you. You can set labels and taints and tolerations directly in here as well that then your applications can pull from. So just useful for whatever you need. Getting into the services. Now, if you are looking at taking like the CKS or something of that sort, you can go into etcd, kubelet, the API server, kube API server, and set the configuration flags directly in that config file, right? That's on the host. With Rancher, we're doing that directly in here, which is awesome. But basically all this is doing is it's taking that declaration and turning those into flags on the host inside the container. Now, we can set default etcd images. We can set a backup configuration that we want. We can, one of the big things is by default, the UID for etcd is 0, which means that if you have root access, you can access etcd. We want to make it so that etcd has its own UID and GID, so there isn't any accidental changes to the database. We can look at retention, so retention of the snapshots, if we need snapshots. Depending on your use case, hopefully if you are being immutable and declarative, you should be able to bring everything back up without any issues. If you're using something stateful, something that requires something on the node, then you might look at having a snapshot. Again, we can get into Kube API, which I think it really is the most functionality in terms of the different Kubernetes services. We can set pod security policy directly in here. Always pull images, have it as false so you can avoid dependencies, especially if you're looking at like Docker Hub or Quay.io and some outages or rate limiting that's applicable. We can set secrets encryption, so we can encrypt them by default to turn them off. And again, I'm getting into what I mentioned earlier, which is audit log policy, which is one of my favorite features that have been brought in the newer versions, but we can configure them so that basically we're spitting out audit logs directly to a specific path in a specific format. And then we can talk about the different policies that we want to monitor. So for this one, we're looking at pods and logs and pods and statuses. We look at their metadata, and all of that information is going to be pushed into the path. Now I put an extra resource down there. So for the audit policy, there's a lot more functionality that you can push into here. We could look at anybody that changes any secrets and anything of that sort. What's great is you can direct it to the backend, which means that if you're using something like FluentD or some sort of logging service, we can say, hey, just push it to where we set up FluentD to pick it up, and then we can bring it into whatever we're using for our logging agent or a logging service. So really a big fan of this functionality. And again, moving on to admission controllers, you can set the admission plugins that you want directly in here. Now I've just put all of them in there, I think since 1.15, but realistically, like if you're running an application, you don't need a default storage class, or you don't need persistent volume labels, or you don't need a limit ranger. Like you should remove those, right? Make sure that we don't have them unless we need them.
Cool. Do you, in your RKE setup, are you setting up highly available Kube API 3 master, or is this for demo purposes a single master?
This, for demo purposes, this is a single master, but you 100% can. And if we go up to the node section, what we can look at is we set our nodes and we have these roles. So if we want to set up an HA, what's the word for it? Stacked topology, which means control plane and etcd. So your control plane components, Kube API server, scheduler, controller manager are all on the node. That's your control plane. etcd is your database. You can separate these. So if you wanted to do a stacked or separate topology, so if you had like 3 control planes and 3 etcds, you basically have 6 nodes, right? 3 that just say control plane and 3 with etcd. And then what you would do is you'd actually go down into the etcd configuration and you would set up your certs so that Kubernetes knows and can configure and knows where those databases are and how to access them. Hopefully that answered the question. This is just demo purpose, 1 node.
Nice, nice, thank you.
Sweet. Now back to the APIs. So event rate limiting is also very important for security. I don't know if anybody's aware of the billion laughs attack that came out, I think it was in 2018, but we can limit the amount of calls to the API, and so that we don't get overwhelmed. If we set it to true, there's a default that gets created. I forget exactly what that default is, but it normally performs the job fairly well. I haven't had any issues with it. Kube controller, so we can set rotate kubelet server certificate to true. These will rotate the cluster certificates. And we can also use RKE to rotate cluster certificates, and you can take it one step further if you go into Rancher 2.0 into the UI. And when you're managing these clusters, you can just one-click rotate the cluster certificates, which is an awesome feature. All right, system images, I'm not going to talk too much about because these are just the default ones that if you set, like you're using Kubernetes version, we're using Hypercube 1.19.3 here. It's just going to have the default ones that are functional with that version. You just want to make sure that, like, if you're setting your Kubernetes version to 1.19, you're not pulling like a CNI from 3 years ago, right? Because then you're basically going to miss out on all that network functionality that's been added. Yeah, moving into additional plugins, in terms of hardening node, if you're going to set defaults that are hardened, you want to get rid of all the extra things that you don't need. That means like ingress monitoring, no private registries, no bastion host, no alerting, and then we're just going to add it as we need it, right? That'll be part of our setup. So either, let's say we're using Prometheus Grafana, or we're using Metric Server and using the Rancher UI to monitor things. That's going to be decided after. This is just that core aspect. And then when you're adding something on, comment it, why are we adding monitoring directly in here versus something else, right? Cluster upgrades. Upgrade strategy is really important if you're doing chaos engineering or you're looking at, trying to break the cluster. It's a great way to do it. Look at and setting that upgrade strategy and looking at your whole application lifecycle is really important, because that's where you're going to experience a lot of downtime if you're pushing to a new version. I know people are hesitant to move off of 1.15 because of the API changes. It was like just a subtle, some subtle deployment issue, API changes, but having that strategy, and then especially if when you have like your testing or let's say your dev, you're testing in your prod environment, you can run those strategies accordingly, right? Using RKE. So I can have 3 identical RKE deployments. I could set up everything as a declarative setup in test, and I can run my update strategy there and see if it works. So we can test out all the bugs before we actually, use that update strategy later on. And then lastly, we have our defaults and add-ons. So ignoring Docker version, we want it so that RKE is going to tell us if the Docker version isn't supported. And we can add add-ons. So I just put a default service count in there, and I set auto mount service tokens to false, because by default tokens get mounted into our containers. That default service count is going to be real pain if we're not launching it. All right. Now, nothing too crazy, but what I am going to do is just set, if we wanted to remove it, I can just do a make RKE remove, and I can tear down this cluster. And I want to use this cluster hardened version. So just the way I wrote it, I'm gonna rename this. Oh, stop doing that. Cluster YAML. Gonna put those IPs back into the config file. And I'm going to bring that cluster back up. So now that cluster is going to have all of the changes that I made. It's going to have the admission controllers that I set. It's going to have, I turned pod security policies off because by default it just denies everything. So unless you basically set your pod security policy and then actually apply it through RBAC controls, nothing will run, just FYI. It's also one of the reasons they deprecated it, because a lot of people did not like that aspect of it. Yeah, this is going to go for a while. I don't want to touch on this too much, but basically we're going to do, it's the same thing. Now we have like 2 basically clusters that we can set up. Let's say, we can have a RKE prod cluster configuration. We can have an RKE test configuration. We can have an RKE. It's the wild lands out there, and the devs go and do whatever they want with it, right? Just that way we have the ability to know, okay, this is what the dev looks like. This is what our test environment looks like. This is how we're doing updates. And we can make changes. We can make changes through a version control system. That's really the core great thing about something like RKE. Cool. Now, with that in mind, so cluster gets set up, application gets going. Where do we go from there? Well, we need some sort of feedback, right? Which is where StackRox comes in. So it's like, how can we supplement RKE? How can we make Kubernetes safer? And not just look at something like runtime. We need to make our configurations, our contexts, and everything just make more sense. So we need feedback, and that's where StackRox comes in. So it's Kubernetes native architecture. So it leverages Kubernetes declarative data, right? It leverages those YAML files, the API, and things of that sort. Gives you the richer context. It doesn't just look at something like runtime or something, or something that's just on the left. It actually gives you a full picture of network policies and still does container image scanning and things of that sort. So again, richer context. It's native to Kubernetes. It's built for Kubernetes, and it's really built for that continuous hardening. So you're getting feedback. You're looking back into your pipeline, saying, "What can I change without hampering my developers?" and then making those changes accordingly. And again, we have a couple different aspects that I'll show you once we get into the UI. But really, we're looking at visibility is huge, obviously, with Kubernetes, right? Being able to understand what's actually running in your cluster stops people from getting off the ground with K8s, right? So visibility, vulnerability management, compliance, network segmentation, risk profiling, configuration management, threat detection, and then incident response. And I don't want to ramble too much about the product. I just kind of want to show you. I think it's lovely UI. So I got to log back in again. This is fun.
Michael, before you log in, could you explain real quick how you installed StackRox? If you've got the code, or you want to show maybe the roxytl, just to highlight real high level how it's installed.
Sure. Let me log in real quick, because I put that file in a different folder. So I'll show after I come back to the
Fantastic.
the folder, but yes, definitely. I have to actually go and pull some defaults that I didn't want to. Sorry, guys. So now we are in StackRox. So it takes a little while to scan. It takes like 5-10 minutes after you install it to get up and running and get all your stuff for you. So I actually have 2 clusters running. This one has SockShop, same setup, same everything. It's just done all the scanning on SockShop. Now, StackRox has gone in. This is just the intro dashboard that you come into. We have violations, we have compliance, violations by clusters, so we can have multiple clusters that we're managing directly through here. We can look at things like risky deployments, violations over time, which is really useful for understanding if you're actually making progress for securing a cluster and reporting too. And we also break down a lot of issues and policies by, again, give you some context, right? Are we following DevOps best practices? Is it privilege escalation? Are we looking at security best practices, vulnerabilities? We can look at them and highlight these specifically. I'm going to start off by just looking at violations in the cluster and head over to this dashboard. So we have all our violations by deployment, because if we're talking with Kubernetes and thinking about Kubernetes in terms of the vulnerabilities and like sort of a kube native mindset, we want to make sure that we're looking at it by deployment and by namespace as well, right? So here's some default policies that are built in here. Fixable CVSS of greater than 6. Obviously, if you have fixable CVSSs and the container's privileged, that provides a little bit more of a risk in Kubernetes. So this is obviously highlighted. The severity is high. We can prioritize based off severity as well. Let's just look at this payment deployment. So again, we can look at some of the fixable issues. So we pulled this image, but obviously if this image is in our repo and we're managing the Docker file, we could look to say, okay, well, here are some of the fixable things we could look at. Let's make those changes in the Docker file upstream and then watch as we push them through our pipeline to see the changes. Now, for the deployment, one of the great things is you can look at the configuration directly in here. So, I can look at all the resources. I can look to see there's no security context here at all, right? Which should trip some flags. And then I can decide the policy criteria if I want to change the policy or do something different with it as well. And we can enforce policy at the different stages. So we can enforce it with the build or at the deploy phase, depending on the integration with your pipeline that we support. And that's just one aspect. When we talk about risk too, risk is different in Kubernetes, right? I think when you get into organizations, especially if they've been around for a while, you talk about risk and it's just like, what does risk mean, right? So Kubernetes kind of takes this, right? At least StackRox takes the approach of you need all the information from the container build all the way to runtime to prioritize risk, right? A lot of security issues in Kubernetes are from just like configuration files just not matching up, extra services or labels not matching up, having multiple ingresses and then not specifying which ingress controller, which leads you to an open thing, or literally just dashboards that are wide open, right? Speaking of which, and so what we want to do is we want to give that risk full context so that you can apply what works for you at home or in your organization, so that you can understand the different aspects, different layers, and then adjust accordingly. So, for example, we have policy violations, some default ones. Image is too old, hasn't been updated in a while. Service configuration, so no capabilities have been dropped. So no links capabilities have been dropped, which is something that you want to look into. Service reachability, now this is not necessarily an issue, but it's just information so that, it's on port 80, no capabilities have been dropped, and it's an older image with a high CVSS score, right? So the more these things are tripped, the more you're kind of going like, we should probably do something about this. Components in the image. So we can break down the components in the image as well. Image freshness, yeah, look at that. Over 4 years since SockShop's been updated. And RBAC configuration. So simple things like deployment is configured automatically and a token is inserted. So we have a default service account with a service token that's automatically mounted into into the pod, into the deployment. So all these things together, we're going to give you priority. I don't even want to go look at cannot TP in priority 1. I'm sure it's because it's privileged. We can look directly in the deployment details. So what's useful, obviously, is if you're doing Kubernetes right, you're going to come in here and be like, wow, that's really high priority. There's a bunch of things that we need to check. It might not be bad. Like this might be something where you know that these are the vulnerabilities and you're aware of it, right? With that being said, you know these issues, then we really should have some labels and annotations in there as to why these privileges were set, right? Why is this image so old? Like, oh yeah, Jim left and he forgot to update last week, right? So just understand that it's to give you the context, but then you also need to react on it and implement, labels, annotations, why you're fixing these things, why you're not fixing certain things, so that the next person that comes along can come in here and look at these deployment details and go, oh, Anna already looked at this and we verified we've done all we can with this. We're going to look to implement something else in the next Kubernetes upgrade, right? Just little things like that. Now, one of my other favorite things, compliance. People started Kubernetes, have no clue, how do we make sure that we stay compliant? StackRox basically gives you everything that you need. So we have all the different compliance standards, and what we can do is we can look at ensuring that we're meeting each standard. So obviously blue means we're meeting it. Some other ones mean we don't. So what we can do is we can look and say, okay, well, ensure auditing is configured for Docker files and directories. So we do this by checking that the rules exist for this. If the rules don't exist, we're going to raise a flag and say you're not compliant based off of the CIS Docker v.12 protocols, right? So little things like that where you can look and say, what do we have to be compliant with? Okay, we need these, and you can go through and make sure all these checks are set up. And now with these checks, let's say it's a Docker check that needs to happen. We just go back, we build that into our IAC so that we know every time we set it up, we're compliant with Docker, right? And lastly, we're going to get into configuration management. Policies, really important. StackRox comes with a bunch of policies built in, and this is, I think, a read-only version of the demo, so I can't actually create policies, but you can create your own as well, and you can automate and change these policies. So let's just do this. So we have a 30-day scan image. So if image is less than 30 days, that's great. It means that a lot of people, it's harder for hackers to exploit. It's a newer image. I wouldn't say use latest, but some people like using the latest versions because it just means it's harder to hack. But you can basically, set the scan age. You can decide where you want to monitor this in terms of life cycle. So there are integrations into pipelines where I can say, okay, well, check this policy as part of the life cycle in the build phase, so we can trip it a little bit earlier. We don't have to wait till it gets into our cluster, into runtime to know if our policy is failing or not. But yeah, there's a bunch of these that you can also change in terms of how you want to enforce it. So let's say we set a policy and this policy is really important for us. We can come in and we can look at the policy findings and make adjustments accordingly for what we need. Yes, there we go. And I can clone, export, edit policies as well. So what's great about these policies is these are like declarative policies, right? Let's say we really want to make a change and want to say nothing gets past 90 days. Well, we can put the rationale specifically into that, or we can edit it to give it more description to say, hey, this is a huge push for us this year, whatever it is. The next person that comes in, they look at it and they're like, why is the severity so high on this when it's really just a 90-day image scan or something like that? It's like, oh no, this is something that we're pushing, right? So again, everything's declarative as code that we can export, clone, change, apply to other clusters. And we can change the policy criteria as well. Andy.
Hey, Mike.
Anything I'm missing?
Yeah, there is quite a bit of conversation about like OPA and AKS and some of the other things. And one of the questions that came up, which I thought was really interesting, was what are the top 5 things customers used for the API to fix? And I think what would be really interesting in answering this is kind of going over the API reference and explain a little bit how some of the customers could potentially use that API to manipulate the platform. Does that make sense?
You might have a little more context on this one.
Okay.
Than me
Go
for
ahead and
this.
click on go ahead and click on API reference in the lower left-hand corner.
Hmm.
So one of the interesting things, and the reason why I have a little more experience is I'm more in the field than Michael is.
Yeah.
So our customers currently use the API, and we have it fully documented here, which is nice. So every time you install the core of the product central, you get the API documentation. Me personally, I use it for configuration points. You know, kind of the thing that Michael's talking about is this declarative code, infrastructure as code kind of thing. Well, if you use the API, the minute you stand up StackRox, you go and set policy banners. You can change the policies, import, export. Another good one is compliance. So if you go to compliance service, I have a script where you can go and ask for compliance scans. So you can run scans periodically and understand kind of the deltas of the underlying infrastructure. Integrations, that's one thing also I'd like you to show when we're done talking about this, but integration service. So you have the ability to configure the, as I like to call it, goes intas and goes outas to the platform. And really the fact that we have this API fully documented and available to you means that you can declaratively configure this such that it's simple, it's repeatable, right? I know I work more in the federal space, and we've got customers that'll stand the entire product up for an hour or two, scan some stuff, and completely collapse it, right? It depends where images are coming from, where images are going, and so it's having that nimbleness, I think, is really important. To dovetail some of this, Mike, why don't you go ahead and show some of the integrations that goes intas and goes outas, as I like to call them?
I don't think I really set that up though on this cluster.
Well, that's fine. We can take a look. So go to platform, configuration, integrations.
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the great things about our platform, I know there were some questions about some of our competitors on the market. Without naming them, for obvious reasons, I think one of the beautiful things is that we're not a walled garden. So what Michael's got on the screen right now is this idea of we can hook into any registry you have or any existing image scanner you have, whether it's Anchor, they're a good partner of ours, or you're using Docker Trusted Registry. I'm allowed to say that I used to work there years ago. But you can connect our scanners, or you can connect Central into pulling the aggregate information from those scanners. So that way, when you go click on vulnerability management, you are getting the absolute latest information, whether we're scanning it or not. What that also means is that our scanner is basically an option to install. No, we think we've got a really good one, but if you've already got an enterprise one, there's no need to double up the effort. Michael, scroll down, please. In addition to the gozintas, in the plugin section, I like to call these the gozoutas. Now, this is where it really kind of mirrors with the policies. So we can go and set specific notification paths, whether it's Jira, Slack, email, syslog, whatever. We can set those policies to notify these plugins in any particular order, or if you want them all to go to syslog, or if you only want certain ones. This gives you the option to be very specific about what information goes where, when, and how. Again, we are not a walled garden. Scroll down a little more, please, Michael. Next, we can talk about some of the backups. We can absolutely back up to any of the object stores out there. And then the last one, which I think is vitally important when we talk about the API, so dovetailing a little bit, is the API token. And this is where you can create tokens. Michael, go ahead and click on that, and then click New, Generate Token, and then Role. Just hit the drop down for the role. So one of the interesting things about our platform with these tokens is that you can assign a RBAC role that's built into the platform, or you can go create your own. So case in point, I've got a script that creates a compliance role and then creates a token against that compliance role. So not only do we recommend least privileged for Kubernetes, but also our platform. So this is a great way to kind of extend and dovetail some of this stuff back together. hopefully that answers most of those questions. Can you, so one of the other questions that I think would be interesting is somebody asked about, you said pod policy is being deprecated. What does that mean?
Yeah, so there's they're not sure exactly how to respond to this, but basically it's not going to be supported after version 1.2.5 for Kubernetes. So in about a year and a half, there will not be pod security policies will not be used. That being said, that doesn't mean that providers or anything else is going to step up to fill that gap. Really, security context and is kind of that core enforcement mechanism, and then you're just building, whether it's pod security policies or OPA or StackRox or something like that on top to then enforce those security contexts at the namespaces. So the community is kind of unsure how to respond. There's talks of picking an open source tool and then just like defaulting like that's the use case. I kind of see in terms of enforcement mechanisms it turning into something like a CNI, where in terms of just security enforcement is going to become part of that piecemeal of the cluster, right? Where you can choose what tool you want to use. Good and bad, there's a lot of discussion. I'd recommend joining the CNCF Slack for SIG Security if you have more questions, and also SIGAuth. Tim Allclair is a really good resource. Hopefully, just don't spam him; he'll get mad at me. But if you want to know more, he actually has a really good. If you join SIGAuth on Slack, he links, I think, in one of the ping channels, a whole breakdown of what they're trying to do with pod security policies and options that they have.
Cool. If there are no other StackRox questions, maybe we can move on to KubeLinter, or if you've got some other points you want to.
We got 30 minutes left, so I just wanted to show quickly the network graph, just in terms of observability, and network policies are just kind of a tough thing for people to implement. So just real quick, we do have like a network policy simulator, which can generate and simulate policies. It's a basic one, so you can upload and simulate your own policies as you write them, which I think is great, especially if you're in some sort of testing or dev environment. You upload them, you check out to see how it works. Okay, we'll implement it into your pipeline now, right? Network policies are that core network feature that I think needs to be adopted, that some don't. There's default, everything is allowed in Kubernetes, right? All right, now let's head over to KubeLinter. So you think, like, obviously we're in the cluster and we have those integrations with those pipelines, but maybe we can automate some of those checks to make sure that we're enforcing it at the dev level, and that's really where KubeLinter comes in. So KubeLinter is an open source tool.
Actually, would you call that shifting left?
Yeah.
Sorry,
if we want to go buzzword
in there.
Yeah, shifting left. I try not to say it, but really. So it analyzes Kubernetes YAML files and Helm charts, and it checks them against a variety of best practices. So basically, you're taking some of those default policies that StackRox has, you're applying them at the command line as a linter, just to make sure that you have the checks, either as part of your pipeline or for the dev as a dev tool in like Visual Studio Code or something like that. And the best thing too is it reports recommendations on how to resolve these issues. So you can use KubeLinter and just not use its enforcement, right? So not use it as like a fail in a pipeline, but just give it to devs to be like, hey, by the way, you need to set a security context. Hey, have you thought about the fact that you don't need privilege escalation for, this container, just to educate them as well. So let's vet some of those controls that we put in. So I'm going to use KubeLinter against SockShot and see what we come up with. By the way, StackRox deploy real quick. You had that question, Andy. StackRox is recommended to use Helm 3 for deploy, but basically we can just automate the install directly in, because everything is configurable as YAML files, and it's either run a script and it gets deployed, or use a Helm to inject Kubernetes. The other thing that I didn't show in the UI is the ability to add clusters. So we can dynamically add clusters or statically add clusters into that user interface so that we can manage multiple clusters, which is great, especially when using something like Rancher, which is your multi and hybrid cloud solution, right? We have Rancher on-prem, we have Rancher in GCP. We can look at the security state of both of those and make adjustments accordingly. So
yeah, one thing I would like to add to that is our install and our whole platform really is Kube native, and so being Kube native not only gives us the whole like we can see everything in Kubernetes, but we deploy like any other application. So we, you know, like Michael said, Helm, or I like the pure KTMLs. It's just a little bit less to install on your local workstation or in terms of automation. But once you have those YAMLs, you check them into version control and manipulate them like any other YAML. So it becomes very easy in terms of the deployment mechanism. In addition, also like he was talking about with Rancher being multi-tenant, or I should say multi-environment, we can also run in a spoken hub model or a decoupled model. The way our functionally put together is our sensors can run on any cluster as long as they have a network path to our central service, and it's pretty straightforward from there on out.
Sweet. Thanks for the context, Andy. So again, I have all these YAML files in here, right, for our sock shop deployment. And I want to look at some, see what's wrong with them. Now, what I can do is just run KubeLinter, which is just a Go binary, very similar to kube control. And what we can do is we can lint, if I can type, where exactly am I? Oh. And so we can lint the configuration files. And we can see exactly what's wrong. Now, there's 46 lint errors, which obviously is a lot. And we see things like there's unset CPU requirements, unset memory requirements. There is a deployment, so the user database is running as non-root. A lot of memory requirements. What else we got here? So we have not set a pod anti-affinity as well. And really, these policies will give you a bunch of context, right? So we have specify pod anti-affinity in your pod spec to ensure that the orchestrator attempts to schedule them on different nodes, right? And it gives you the link to documentation as well to help you out. Now, if you want to learn more, I'll probably head over here first. So you can find KubeLinter on GitHub. Again, it's pretty simple to install. It's just a Go binary, so you can install it using Go, build it from source, or you can use Brew if you're on a Mac to install it. Fairly simple though. Now, to show you what some of the policies look like, let's go to docs.kubelinter.io.
Hey, Michael, how give me the TLDR, give me the 8-second elevator pitch. What is KubeLinter good for? 8 seconds, go.
Quick YAML checks so you don't screw up. Automate some YAML checks, especially when you have like multiple different groups. Let's say you are a medium shop and I don't want to go and learn all these different contexts, and maybe I'm just trying to build a Kubernetes in my workplace. I'm not trying to go use open, implement Rego or something like that. I can just implement it simply on the command line and set some basic checks as part of my pipeline, right? That was more than 8 words, but yeah. So again, go over to KubeLinter.io. It's got everything here. It's got building from source, how to use it, example GitHub actions, how to run it. There's a couple examples here for Kubernetes versus Helm as well. I just kind of showed you some of the basic things, but pretty simple. KubeLinter lint, right? You can do a couple other things, which is you can just look at the charts and look at the templates directly from the command line, but I just come in here if I really need to get something that's more visible. The other thing I just want to go over real quick are these checks. So like I said, I ran checks against all those YAML files. Some are enabled by default, some are disabled, right? So I'm going to show you in 2 seconds the config file. I just know that there are, I think, like 19 or 20 checks, and some can be applied to services, some can be applied to deployments, some can be applied to both. So you have a lot of configuration options to set this up. Now back to this. So like I said, it's a config file. There's 46 lint errors. Now, for the lint file, what we can do is we can actually set a config file that holds basically all of these policies and either enable them or disable all of them. So we can say, we want to add all built-in to true. Let's say I save that and I run a lint, but instead I'm going to run it against this config file. Oh, and I can't type again.
It's because everybody's watching, that's why.
That's how it works. All right, so I ran all of the default checks and I have 107 lint errors. Now, some of these default checks are, things like there's no labels, there's no annotations, right? So what we can do is we can say there has to be labels, there has to be annotations, there has to be these things, and we can push best practice down onto our users. And we don't necessarily have to enforce it too. Like we can just say, we're going to trip these as part of the dev process. So just know, like, you can go and run this in dev, but in order to get to the test process, you have to fix all of these lint errors. You have to actually make sure there's labels, annotations, or specific ports aren't there, and things of that sort.
Would you consider, would you consider adding KubeLinter part of the production pipeline for CI?
I think that you add it further left.
Okay.
For the term, like I think it's best used at the dev stage, especially for a lot of education. And really, like, if you have your version control system, you might do something where I'm going to lint it as part of like a pipeline, and it's going to show all the errors, but I'm not going to actually stop you from merging to your own branch, let's say, or pushing to your own branch. It's just going to be like, hey, by the way, this is the output here. But then if you're ever going to actually push it into the main branch or something like that pipeline is going to fail, right? So, and then it really just depends on how you've configured your repositories, but I find it really useful just for an easy setup as an education tool. And obviously 107 lint errors is a lot. You don't necessarily need to have all that. Some of these aren't necessary, right? What we can do is we can say, I want to add all built in, and we can set that to true, and then we can go down to exclude, and we can say we want to, let's say, ignore, let's say, required annotation email, required label owner, right? We can get rid of those. And now when we point to it, we're only gonna have 77 lint errors, right? So we can kind of go through and be like, what do we need? What do we not need? And make adjustments accordingly. So we have kind of that default configuration set up. The other thing too, that always helps, since you're doing everything as code, write why you don't need something, right? Extremely useful. Just so that the next person coming along is just like, oh, here's a config file. Why is this error getting tripped? Oh yeah, Mike is just forcing me to do this. So
nice.
Yeah. There's two other things I want to highlight before I get to questions. I think I got like 25 minutes left. Custom checks. So everything, there are templates with KubeLinter where we can go in and we can adjust these templates to meet our needs. Now, some are for deployments, some are for deployments and services. There's some new functionality being built in, and if you want more, join Slack or raise an issue on KubeLinter. The developers are very quick and happy to get back to you. And what that looks like is I can basically check that one. So I can say I require an annotation, and it has to have this specific annotation there too. So not only are you saying the required annotation needs to be there, but it has to have a specific value. And then when I run it, I also got rid of the required label on an annotation email. But now I have more than what I had before. I think it was like 112 lint errors. Now I have 138, right? So it's running against all those deployments and saying, you don't have this required annotation. Make sure you set the demo field, please. So if you're an admin, this could be something where the remediation is just, put this key in the annotation so that I know it's you that's pushing it. And then you put that into your dev pipeline, right? So that every single, developer or somebody who's setting the config file just knows, oh yeah, I gotta put my email in here. Little things like that. It's just an automated way of getting people to follow best practice and just letting them know exactly what's going on. Yeah, a couple other things like, required label releases here. You set the custom check, you say exactly what you want for remediation. I point at it and it'll say set the team field, please, right? Now, last thing I'll touch on is, since I was working with this user SVC user service and user deployment, what we can do is, if obviously there's specific use cases we want to ignore, we can go into these and say, hey, here's this demo here. Let's just let's ignore all the checks against this. Now I have 149 checks. So that was violating 3 policies. Now it's still violating 3 policies, but we're just ignoring it, right? And then maybe you go and say, hey, Mike's doing what he wants today, right? So
In the
that
Fed space,
now
that's called the mission card.
yeah. But yeah, so you're saying that to whoever's going to be reviewing it, this is what's going on. And then when they go through and it's like, oh, this error got checked, what's going on? I go into the deployment and I'm like, oh, okay, you're testing something, that's fine. We have it on record. We know what's going on. And I don't need to Slack somebody and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. They just automatically know exactly what I'm trying to accomplish here. Last thing is we can ignore specific checks. So again, we can say, I want to ignore .check KubeLinter.io, and I'm going to ignore the required label owner. So it's not necessary, it's for demo purposes. And now I have 51. So it dropped basically 2 of those policy issues, I believe, or 1. But again, there's a lot of flexibility in how you use it. The other thing too is there's a lot of flexibility in how you build it into your pipeline. So real quick, I'm just going to go up to this GitHub workflow. Now, this action is actually on GitHub. If you want to go and look, I have it set like it's going to trip it. It's never going to pass unless I go and clear all those or I turn them all off. But basically, I'm downloading, running KubeLinter as part of the pipeline, going into the workspace, and just running that KubeLinter lint against the config file that I've set up. You can run this a couple times, so I don't need to run against the whole folder, right? I can run it against a specific YAML, and I can have a specific configuration for that YAML. So what's great is, let's say you have a couple different teams working on a pipeline. Well, I can just go, okay, well, this is team here, team here, team here, team here, and run different lints against each team. So you can start to develop policies. What's great about developing those policies and starting to get that baseline for how your teams are working is then if you ever like want to grow, or let's say you actually require something that is more intuitive, something like StackRox, now I already know some of the policies that I implement, and I can take that declaration of what's going on for my dev environment and go and port that into StackRox and say, hey, we're going to, here's this annotation about this deployment and what's going on. I already have that information, and it's written as code as a check. So again, it's really useful just for if you don't even want to enforce it, just for observability about what's going on with your deployments. And you do have a lot of flexibility in how you implement and how you check it. And I think it's really powerful admin tool. And even people who are just starting with Kubernetes, like if you're studying for a test or something like that, all of these default checks are going to point to some things to say like, hey, on set memory requirements, you need to set some memory requirements and understand what your application is doing, right? So again, good educational tool, really easy to implement, not a big knowledge gap in terms of kube control to KubeLinter, and easy to implement into your pipeline. So
cool. Well, while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I've got one. I'm going to set you up a little bit, but in terms of this whole shift left right, KubeLinter does a good job of linting the YAMLs. Is there anything else in the StackRox platform that the developer can use around images?
Well, yeah, in the StackRox platform, sure. I mean, in terms of what I would say, if you're, it one depends on how your teams are set up, but really, if the developer is basically just working in the Docker configure in like Docker desktop and just working in their Docker image build, really what you're supposed to do is just pull it out and you can like look at configuration. The other thing too is, we do have a CLI, so that scanner can be used directly on the command line. There's like a ROX control image check. So basically the exact scanner that's here, you can have locally that will check your image. But yeah, really it's, if I was to show you some of the, if the developer was in here, you'd be looking at the container issues. Where is this? Please tell me. Where am I going? There we go. Vulnerabilities. So if I come into vulnerabilities, like this is probably the place where the developer worked the most, because really what you're trying to do is that Docker image should not know that it's even running in Kubernetes. If we're talking about best practices, the way we structure our applications, any configurations or anything like that should be done by like an init container, or any secrets that are pushed in should be pushed in from some other sort of secret management store, and our image should be set. So we come in here, we look at our vulnerabilities, we make adjustments upstream, and what we can do is we can as a developer, understand like where the configuration is. So I can look to say, hey, these are the issues within my scope that I can manage. And here's the configuration for the deployment as it goes in. So I know what my application's doing, and I can see what the configuration is in Kubernetes. That being said, they are separate from each other, right? And yeah, like I said, the ROX control, we can do that image scan directly at the source. So the developer has the tool to scan the image. Your pipeline should have the tool to scan the image, and then we're performing the scanning basically on the cluster to make sure that image is secure. So you basically have 3 layers there. Mix and match as you need it. And yeah, it's really about the flexibility that comes with Kubernetes, because really Kubernetes and containers is supposed to enable speed, right? It's supposed to help your developers. And if we're being honest, a lot of security tools don't always do that, right? You have security people who say, hey, we can't even adopt Kubernetes because I have no clue how to secure it. So that's what StackRox really took that in stride and said, here's all the context you need. Now it's up to you to understand how you need to apply it. And you can, here's the tools, here's the developer tools, right? Here's the integration into your pipelines, right? Here's the enforcement at runtime in your cluster. And you have the flexibility to enable and disable things as you need to make sure your developers require it. The only thing we're missing is like an RKE-linter. That's what we need as a tool. Andy, you're on that?
Yep, absolutely. Next week.
Next week.
If you had, looking at all the different touch points, the surface area between RKE, K8s, effectively K8s, and KubeLinter, is there like a TLDR? Is there like the go-to hit list? Like, what would you recommend to new people to Kubernetes on how to apply security? Do you have a one-liner?
So
again, that 8-second elevator pitch.
If you're securing Kubernetes, RKE and their hardening guide are a great place to start. It is a containerized version, easy to set up and get going, and there's all the resources there to help you understand why we're setting up what we're doing, right? That's in Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, really what you're doing too is you're also automating your cluster setup. So after you've gotten to the point where you understand Kubernetes and you've gotten started, now, like I just did, I just pulled up a cluster, pulled it down, pulled it up, pulled it up, pulled it down. I can just go and drop that in my pipeline, start up a cluster, start up your IAC, deploy, your application, whatever it is. That's really the best place to get started, and that's taking advantage of the ecosystem, so to speak. It's not just Kubernetes, it's all the pieces around it, it's all the automation around it, and the checks to help you speed up delivery, basically.
Nice.
I'm really terrible at this whole 8-word thing, eh?
8-second thing, yeah. You don't take many elevators, right?
Yeah.
The questions have pretty much dried up. There's one for the Rancher team. Where's the 2.5 hardening guide? Rancher does have hardening guides, specifically around all of their, for lack of a term, suite of tools. Like their hardening guide 2.4, and I'll post that in the chat. But their hardening guide 2.4 references like CIS 1.5, Kubernetes 1.15, Rancher version 2.4. So that could be an interesting add-on. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting way to kind of secure, to validate, externally validate some of the RKE and potentially RKE2 configurations, which is nice.
Yeah, I mean, so even in this secure sort of YAML file I set up, a lot of the way I structure this is based off of RKE's documentation. Now I tweak a little things because like I need that, I don't want that, I don't want to shut down that, right? Or pod security policies were enabled, I disable them so that the application would actually run. But it's a great place to start. The hardening docs for 2.5. I also believe, I don't think the benchmarks have really changed since 2.4 came out. So it's like RKE, maybe they're just in process. I don't want to speak for a Rancher, but has everything you need to get started, I'll say that.
Right, so I also posted in the chat it's not the hardening guide for 2.5, but there is actually I'll post it in chat as well, but there's some documentation on 2.5.
Mm-hmm.
There we go, posted in the chat.
Copy paste the link, yeah, great.
Yeah, and is there a repo that everyone go to get the slides, even though the slides are relatively simple?
Yeah.
What's the best way to contact you and I? Do you have a
Yeah,
good
so
slot?
I'm in the Kubernetes Slack, CNCF Slack, Kubernetes Slack,
Rancher user Slack.
LinkedIn, Twitter. Like I check everything. So if you can find me, I'll respond to it. But yeah, Rancher Slack as well. Yeah, there's the masterclass. I'll be in there. Just if you have any questions, ping there. I'll try to drop as many links as I can. And I'm sure,
Cool.
I don't want to speak for Connie, but I'm sure that the recording will probably be mentioned as well. So yeah.
That reminds me, I got to join the masterclass Slack channel. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say maybe there's some questions in there. I've been rambling
I'm
a
not
bit, so I
finding
haven't
any.
even checking. No, not too bad.
Okay, so we got one, looks like one last question. For bigger clusters, not to cause some DOS, denial of service, towards image repos, what is the recommended offload caching way? So I'll jump on that because that seems more like registry pull through cache question, which I got a little experience with. Honestly, it comes down to what does your network topography look like and what is the image provenance you want to ensure? In other words, you especially with SolarWinds, it seems like every 12 to 18 months we have a re-emphasis on supply chain security, and we seem to forget the lessons of the past continually, which I love. And so really what that comes down to in terms of what does that caching look like? Try to have as few sources of truth as possible and try not to rely on the cache. Try to make sure that the source of truth is the source of truth. And my personal favorite phrase is no human should build or deploy code meant for production. So automate all the things, run through CI/CD, all the things. Yeah, that's gonna be your best approach. And unfortunately nowadays, that balance between team, organization, enterprise, because let's face it, Kate's is still relatively new. That a lot of organizations and companies and agencies are still figuring out, okay, who's going to own what piece of this entire pie. So it's unfortunately still a free for all. So Michael, do you have a slide, a go-to action if they want to learn more about StackRox?
Oh, I did before I got rid of it though.
Well, if anybody would like more information on StackRox, StackRox.com. Feel free to reach out there. I know you can reach me at andy@StackRox.com. And like Michael said, we're all in the Rancher CNCF Slack channels. Feel free to reach out to us or just find us on the tweeters if that's more your style. Yeah, if that's more your style. And now that because this is being recorded, it's not Rox Cuddle or Control. It's Rox-CTL. It's kubectl. I'm sorry. Okay. I put my flag in the ground for that.
Yeah. I actually remember there was a survey, I think at KubeCon, and it was like a 30-30 in terms of the way people say it.
Oh yeah, it's like regional with soda and pop and.
Yeah, I'm a fence sitter. I'll just wait until we decide.
Awesome. If we don't have any more questions.
Great.
No. Thanks, Connie.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for going over all that great content today. We can share the slides and any of the reference links that you guys want to include. So that will go via a follow-up email. Should be out by the end of this week to everybody that attended today. So you'll be able to reference those. And just to wrap up here, for any of the Rancher products that you guys want to check out, just head over to rancher.com. We have tons of docs and other reference or other resources there available for you. And if you enjoyed our masterclass today, we do have another one coming up on February 9th. These always take place at 2 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays. So head over to rancher.com/events to find that one, along with our newly announced February online meetup, which will dive into the new Longhorn 101, which was just released today. And a couple more additional resources if today was a little bit over your head and you want to take a step back and learn a little bit more about Kubernetes and Rancher in general. You can sign up for our bi-weekly trainings at rancher.com/training. Or on the flip side, if you would like to become a certified Rancher operator and you feel very confident in using Rancher, you can do so at academy.rancher.com. So that wraps it up for today. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you, Michael and Andy, for a great presentation and all the great questions. I hope everybody has a good rest of their day.
Thanks for joining. Take care.
Bye, y'all.